In 1944, in a quiet mill town deep in South Carolina, a 14-year-old black boy was pulled from his home, accused of a crime he could never have committed, and tried, convicted, and executed, all within 77 days. His name was George Junius Stinney Jr. At just 14, he became the youngest person executed in the United States in the 20th century. But behind the headlines lies a deeper story, one of fear, prejudice, and injustice that reveals the brutal reality of America's segregated South. A story that would vanish into silence for 70 years, until the truth began to resurface. Today, we're traveling back to the mid-1940s, to a quiet mill town in the American South, where one of the most heartbreaking cases in U.S. legal history began. About 90 miles from Charleston, South Carolina, stood the small community of Alcolu. Founded in the late 1800s by lumber entrepreneur D.W. Alderman, Alcolu was built around the Alderman Lumber Company. By 1890, it had grown into a typical southern mill town. Workers lived in modest, company-owned houses, earned their pay at the sawmill, and shopped at the company's store that deducted purchases directly from their wages. Over time, the town added a hotel, churches, and a few schools, forming a close-knit but divided community. By the 1940s, Alcolu had become home to several thousand residents. Among them was the Stinney family. The father, George Junius Stinney Sr., worked long hours at the local mill, a steady but demanding job that paid just enough to support his wife and 4 children. Their small wooden house came with a fenced yard, a chicken coop on one side, and a single cow grazing behind it. The Stinney children helped care for the animals and kept the home tidy, a daily routine that taught discipline and responsibility even in hardship. The Stinneys' eldest child was George Jr., followed by Charles, Catherine, and the youngest, Emmy. Their parents were strict but loving, determined to raise their children with good manners, faith, and respect, despite the world around them offering so little fairness in return. Like many towns in the Deep South during the era of Jim Crow segregation, Alcolu was physically and socially divided. The railroad tracks that ran through the center of town marked the invisible boundary between black and white residents. White families lived and shopped on one side, black families like the Stinneys on the other. Each had their own schools, churches, and community spaces. George Sr. warned his children never to cross those tracks unnecessarily. In 1944, South Carolina, racial lines weren't just social. They were enforced by law and by violence. For a young black boy, even a misunderstanding could turn dangerous. Every Sunday, the Stinney family walked together to the Green Hill Baptist Church, their spiritual refuge, just down the road. Church wasn't only a place of worship, it was the beating heart of the black community. Within those walls, families found strength, connection, and the comfort of shared faith. It was where they could be seen, heard, and valued, away from the segregation and prejudice that shaped daily life outside. For young George and his family, those Sunday mornings were more than ritual. They were a reminder of dignity, hope, and unity in a world that too often denied them both. Friday, the 24th of March, 1944, began like any other day in Alcolu. The morning sun shimmered over the pine forests that surrounded the settlement, and the scent of freshly cut lumber drifted through the air. To anyone walking down the dirt roads, it felt like an ordinary, peaceful day in a quiet southern town. That afternoon, 14-year-old George Stinney Jr. and his little sister, Emmy, who was just 7, finished their lessons at the segregated black school and returned home. Like most children their age, their after-school hours were filled with chores. The family's cow needed to be taken out to graze, and this simple routine, something they did almost every day, was part of their small but steady life in Alcolu. Just a short distance away, 2 other children were setting off on their own adventure. 11-year-old Betty June Binnicker and 7-year-old Mary Emma Thames, both white girls from the other side of the tracks, were enjoying a carefree afternoon. Armed with a single bicycle between them, they pedaled through the warm, breezy air, giggling as they searched for maypops, the sweet, fragrant fruit of the wild passionflower vine that grew thick along the railroad line. As the afternoon stretched on, the girls' playful search led them toward the edge of the black neighborhood. There, near a small open field, they noticed two children, George and Emmy, watching over their grazing cow. The girls rode up and asked if they knew where to find any maypops. George, polite but shy, told them he didn't. It was a brief, harmless conversation, just seconds long. The children went their separate ways. Betty June and Mary Emma continued down the tracks, still laughing, while George and Emmy led their cow back home as the evening light began to fade. But as the sun set over Alculu, that ordinary day began to unravel. Later that evening, while visiting a neighbor's house, the Stinney family heard disturbing news. Word had spread quickly through town. Two young girls hadn't returned home. Their bicycles were missing, and their families were frantic. Hearing the names, Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames, George Jr. spoke up. He told his father that he and Emmy had seen the girls earlier that afternoon near the railroad tracks. He described their short exchange, thinking it might help the searchers find where the girls had gone. As night fell, the small town transformed into a search zone. Townspeople, police officers, and volunteers fanned out across the area, through pine groves, overgrown fields, and swampy ditches, calling the girls' names into the darkness. Lanterns glowed faintly among the trees, and the once peaceful town was now thick with unease. By dawn the next morning, hope still lingered. Many believed the girls had simply wandered off and would return home, tired and dirty but safe. Yet, at around 7 a.m. on March 25th, that fragile hope was shattered. A group of men searching near the black section of town noticed small footprints pressed into the damp soil, the kind only a child could leave. Following the trail, one of them spotted something glinting in the dirt, a pair of scissors. Locals knew that Betty June often carried a pair to cut maypops during her outings. Moments later, deeper in a thicket beside a waterlogged ditch, the men saw a bicycle half hidden beneath tangled vines. When they pulled the brush aside, their discovery turned their stomachs cold. Lying on their backs in the shallow water were the missing girls, Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames. One of the searchers jumped into the ditch, desperately checking for any sign of life. But as soon as his hand touched their cold skin, he knew it was too late. Both children were dead. The scene was horrific. Each girl bore severe head injuries, the result of repeated blows from what investigators would later describe as a blunt metal object, possibly a piece of iron. The town of Alcolu, where nothing ever seemed to happen, was suddenly gripped by fear, grief, and outrage. That morning marked the end of Alcolu's peace and the beginning of one of the most tragic and controversial legal cases in American history. The bodies of Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames were soon taken to Dr. Asbury Cecil Bozard, the county physician, for examination. His findings confirmed what the townspeople feared. The girls had been brutally beaten to death. 7-year-old Mary Emma had a deep gash above her right eyebrow and severe head trauma that proved fatal. 11-year-old Betty June had suffered multiple blows to the back of her head, struck again and again with a heavy, blunt object. Dr. Bozard later remarked that the extent of their injuries was unlike anything he had ever seen in his medical career. While shock and grief gripped the small town of Alcolu, life at the Stinney household continued quietly that same afternoon. George Jr. was at home with his older half-brother Johnny, who was preparing to leave for military service. Their youngest sister, Emmy, played in the yard with a brood of baby chicks that had recently hatched. Their parents were away, and the other siblings, Charles and Catherine, were out as well. It was for a brief moment a normal, peaceful scene in an otherwise ordinary Southern home. But that peace was suddenly shattered. Emmy later recalled that she was still in the yard when she noticed two cars slowly driving down their dirt road. They stopped abruptly in front of the Stinney house, and several white men in uniforms stepped out. Without knocking or speaking, they walked straight through the back door of the small wooden house. Emmy, terrified, instinctively ran to the chicken coop and hid among the hens. From the shadows, she watched as the men emerged moments later, escorting her brothers, George and Johnny, in handcuffs. Within minutes, George Jr. was placed in one car, Johnny in another, and both vehicles drove off without explanation. Emmy could only watch, frozen with fear, as the cars disappeared down the dusty road. The situation escalated almost immediately. When word of the arrest spread, George Stinney Sr. was fired from his job at the local sawmill. Rumors of a possible lynch mob began to circulate, and fearing for their lives, George Sr. and his wife gathered their remaining children and fled the town under the cover of night. They found temporary refuge with relatives in Pinewood, South Carolina, roughly 20 miles away. As they left, Mrs. Stinney wept uncontrollably, not knowing if she would ever see her son again. That night, Johnny Stinney was released. Officers left him on the side of a rural road, forcing him to make his own way home on foot. George Jr., however, was not released. At the Clarendon County Sheriff's Office, the 14-year-old was interrogated alone, without his parents, without a lawyer, and without any adult advocate. He was questioned by Deputy Sheriff H.S. Newman and State Investigator S.J. Pratt, both white men. Other officers searched the Stinney home and the surrounding property for any sign of evidence linking the boy to the murders, but they found nothing. After roughly an hour of questioning, Sheriff Newman emerged from the room claiming that George Stinney had confessed to killing the two girls. But there was no written confession, no signed statement, and no witnesses to confirm that such an admission had ever been made. Despite the complete lack of physical evidence or documentation, the sheriff publicly declared that the case was solved, and with that, the frightened 14-year-old was placed under official custody, accused of a double murder. The coroner's inquest was held on March 29, 1944, only a few days after the discovery of the girls' bodies. It was meant to determine whether there was enough evidence to justify a murder charge, but the process was deeply flawed from the start. Among the 6 jurors selected for the inquest was George Burke, a local man who had actually been part of the search party that found the victims. Instead of being called as a witness, Burke was appointed foreman of the jury, a serious conflict of interest that violated even the limited procedural fairness of the time. The inquest was brief and largely one-sided, ending with the jurors recommending that George Stinney Jr. be charged and sent before a grand jury. Astonishingly, when the grand jury convened soon afterward, the very same George Burke again took part, this time as one of the jurors responsible for approving the indictment. It was a sign that the system in Clarendon County was moving swiftly and not in the direction of justice. Before the trial, George's mother was allowed to visit him for a few short minutes. Through tears, the frightened 14-year-old told her how scared he was, insisting again that he hadn't hurt anyone. But the legal machinery had already been set in motion, and it was moving fast. A special request was filed to expedite the trial, and it was granted almost immediately. Jury selection began soon after, and within just 31 days of his arrest, George found himself sitting in the Clarendon County Courthouse. He was completely alone, no family in the courtroom, no supporters, and no real defense team to stand by him. His court-appointed attorney was Charles Plowden, a local tax commissioner with no experience in criminal defense. Historical accounts suggest that Plowden had political ambitions and saw the appointment as a formality, not as a fight for a child's life. The prosecution's presentation was short and heavily reliant on hearsay. In addition to 3 law enforcement officers, they called only 3 civilian witnesses, including Reverend Francis Batson, one of the men who had discovered the bodies. The state's entire case rested on the alleged confession George was said to have given during interrogation, though no signed statement, no transcript, and no physical evidence supported it. Prosecutors even offered 2 contradictory versions of what George supposedly said. In one version, they claimed he struck the girls after one of them attacked him when he tried to help her out of a ditch. In another, they alleged he followed them, killed Mary Emma first, and then turned on Betty June. These conflicting narratives would have been easy to challenge, but no challenge ever came. When it was time for the defense, Attorney Plowden called no witnesses, presented no evidence, and didn't cross-examine the officers who claimed George had confessed. He didn't even bring Emmy Stinney, George's 7-year-old sister, who could have testified that her brother was with her at the time the girls disappeared. In fact, Emmy had never once been questioned by investigators. The entire trial lasted barely 2.5 hours. The all-white jury, made up entirely of local men, deliberated for less than 10 minutes before returning their verdict: guilty of murder in the first degree. Judge Philip H. Stoll, presiding over the case, wasted no time. He sentenced George Stinney Jr. to death by the electric chair, setting the date of execution just weeks away. For George, a small, quiet boy of 14, the trial that was supposed to determine his guilt or innocence had instead become a swift formality. His fate had been sealed long before he ever stepped into that courtroom. In the weeks that followed the trial, George Stinney's family and supporters desperately tried to save his life. His parents, through local advocates, appealed to South Carolina Governor Olin D. Johnston, pleading for clemency, but their request was denied. The NAACP, several church leaders, and civil rights groups across the South also wrote letters, urging the governor to intervene, arguing that the boy's trial had been a travesty of justice. Yet, their appeals went unanswered. While George's case was being dismissed with alarming speed, another case in the same state revealed just how unequal justice in the Jim Crow South could be. Only a month earlier, 16-year-old Ernest Edmund Feltwell, a white teenager from Parris Island, South Carolina, had been charged with the murder of an 8-year-old girl in Columbia, the state's capital. During his trial, Feltwell admitted responsibility, but claimed the death was accidental. Prosecutors alleged that he had attacked the young girl while attempting a sexual assault. After entering an initial not guilty plea, Feltwell changed it to guilty of second-degree murder on the advice of his attorneys. His written confession was signed in the presence of 2 court-appointed lawyers and accepted by the court. At sentencing, Judge J. Watties Waring told the boy that modern institutions sought rehabilitation rather than revenge. He sentenced Feltwell to 20 years in prison, assuring that he would not be placed among hardened criminals and could learn a trade while incarcerated. The judge even stated that Feltwell would be eligible for parole after serving 1/3 of his sentence, if his conduct warranted it. For George Stinney, there would be no such mercy. All petitions and appeals were rejected. The state set his execution date for Friday, June 16, 1944, barely 83 days after his arrest. His parents were permitted to see him one final time before the execution. During that visit, George, frightened and tearful, continued to insist that he was innocent. At 7:30 a.m., inside the South Carolina State Penitentiary in Columbia, George Junius Stinney Jr., just 14 years old and weighing barely 90 pounds, was led to the electric chair. He was so small that officials placed a Bible beneath him to raise his height enough for the electrodes to align properly. Guards strapped his arms, legs, and chest tightly to the chair. When asked if he had any last words, George answered softly and respectfully, "No, sir." A leather strap was placed across his mouth, and witnesses later reported seeing a single tear roll down his cheek. The mask that was supposed to cover his face was too large, slipping loose as the current surged through his small body. Within moments, George Stinney Jr., the youngest person executed in the United States in the 20th century, was gone. After his execution, George Junius Stinney Jr. was laid to rest in an unmarked grave at the Calvary Baptist Church Cemetery in Sumter County, South Carolina. The burial was simple and quiet. No ceremony, no marker, just grief and silence. His death made national headlines in 1944, with newspapers across the country reporting that America had executed its youngest person in modern history. For a brief moment, the case sparked outrage and disbelief. But in the middle of World War II, the public's attention quickly turned elsewhere. As the years passed, the story faded from memory. The town of Alcolu moved on, and so did the rest of the country. For decades, the Stinney family carried their pain in silence, avoiding the spotlight out of fear and heartbreak. George's father, George Stinney Jr., passed away in 1965 at the age of 63. His mother, Stinney, lived quietly until her death in 1989, in her 80s. The children who had once played together in that little company house by the tracks grew old under the shadow of what had happened to their brother. On the 50th anniversary of the execution, George's sister, Catherine Stinney Robinson, broke that silence. In an interview, she revealed that while George was in jail, he had written letters home, insisting that he was innocent and begging his family to stay strong. His siblings had never doubted him, not for a moment. Decades later, in 2013, George's surviving family decided it was finally time to act. They petitioned the state of South Carolina to reopen the case, arguing that George's trial had been unconstitutional. They claimed his confession had been coerced, that he had no legal defense, and that there had been no physical evidence tying him to the crime. Two attorneys, Stephen McKenzie and Matt Burgess, took on the case pro bono, filing a motion in Clarendon County Court to vacate George's conviction. Their request was granted, and in January 2014, a formal hearing was held. Among the witnesses was George's sister, Emmy Ruffner, who, for the first time in 70 years, told the court what she had seen the day her brother was taken away. In December 2014, Circuit Court Judge Carmen T. Mullen issued a historic ruling. She declared that George Stinney Jr.'s constitutional right to a fair trial had been violated, calling the 1944 proceeding so fundamentally unfair that it could not be allowed to stand. Judge Mullen's decision did not declare George innocent, but it vacated his conviction, acknowledging that the legal system had failed him. It was a symbolic victory, decades too late to save a child's life, but it brought a measure of peace to a family that had waited 70 years for the truth to be heard. Still, the ruling did not bring universal agreement. Some relatives of the victims, Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames, expressed disappointment at the decision. They argued that the evidence, as they understood it, still pointed to George's guilt. Betty Binnicker's niece said her family had researched the case extensively and accused the public of oversimplifying the story. Another relative admitted that the original trial had been unfair and that George should never have been executed, but still believed he had been involved in the girls' deaths. Over the years, rumors have persisted about other possible suspects, including stories of a deathbed confession from a member of a prominent local family, but no such confession has ever been verified, and no official reinvestigation has been launched. In 2014, the people of Alcolu placed a small memorial marker in George's honor. It reads, "Wrongly convicted, illegally executed by the state of South Carolina. Conviction vacated by court order." That simple monument stands not just as a remembrance of a young boy, but as a solemn reminder of how swiftly injustice can take a life, and how long it can take for truth to be restored. 70 years. That's how long it took for the world to admit that something went terribly wrong in that small South Carolina town. George Stinney Jr. was just 14, a child who should have been worried about school, family, and the life ahead of him. Instead, he became a symbol of how quickly justice can be silenced when truth is buried beneath fear and prejudice. The court that condemned him is gone. The men who judged him have long since passed. But the story of George Stinney, the boy they buried without a name, still speaks, louder than ever across time. It reminds us that justice isn't measured by how quickly a verdict is reached, but by how fiercely a society defends its most powerless. In Alcolu, a small marker now stands where his story began. Carved into the stone are 7 simple words: wrongly convicted, illegally executed, conviction vacated by court order. They can't bring George back, but maybe, just maybe, they remind us why his story must never be forgotten. This was the case of George Junius Stinney Jr., the youngest person ever executed in the United States, and the boy the world took 70 years to finally hear. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to subscribe our channel Forgotten Inquests for more deep dives into history's chilling true crime cases, forgotten tragedies, and haunting mysteries that time tried to bury. Share this video with friends who love exploring the hidden corners of history, and help keep these lost stories alive. We'll meet again in another journey through history's darkest corners. Until then, stay safe and take care of yourself and your family.